She thought chaining off the only road in and out of our neighborhood would make her untouchable. At 6:12 a.m., sparks flew as her bolt cutters snapped through the last city padlock, steel clanging against pavement while her smug smile lit up like she'd just conquered Rome. "Community safety," she muttered, waving the chain like a trophy. But what she didn't know was that road wasn't just my driveway, it was a county-maintained emergency access route, legally protected under state law. And blocking it wasn't just petty HOA bullying, it was a criminal act. I stood there in uniform boots, dirt from a night shift still clinging to me, watching her trap an entire neighborhood inside like prisoners. See, I'm not some random homeowner, I'm a former sheriff's deputy, and I know exactly what happens when you obstruct a public access road. So I made one phone call. And by the time the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, Karen's reign over Willow Ridge was about to collapse in front of every neighbor she had terrorized. Drop a comment if you've ever wished the sheriff would roll up on your HOA. You're going to want to hear how this ended. I was raised in this county, where the dirt under your boots carried stories and every sunrise smelled of smoke from the hills. My father wore turnout gear, a firefighter whose cracked hands taught me that law isn't just words, it's duty. He drilled into me that protecting people meant standing tall even when it cost you. I grew into the badge, serving as a sheriff's deputy until life pulled me another direction. But the instincts never left. The weight of justice clung like sweat in summer. Some men retire from service, others carry it in their bones. I thought I'd buried that part of me, I thought the battles were over, but this road would drag me right back into a war. This stretch of asphalt isn't just convenience, it's survival. It's the only artery for ambulances screaming toward oxygen tanks, for fire trucks roaring when the ridge sparks, for school buses rattling with kids half awake and clutching juice boxes. I've watched medics hustle down it with stretchers, watched headlights carve through midnight when minutes meant lives. The road doesn't care about property values or curb appeal, it breathes safety into every porch light that flickers on at dusk. Block it, and you don't just inconvenience neighbors, you gamble with the frail lungs of the elderly, the heartbeat of children, the survival of an entire block. Block that road, and you gamble with lives. This land is more than mine. It's my father's shadow cast across cracked pavement. Each faded line recalls his nights battling flames while neighbors slept. He left me more than property. He left me a promise: protect the people, even if they never thank you. Every breeze carries the echo of his command, and every mark on this road feels like his signature, which is why watching someone try to take it felt like watching them spit on his grave. And then came Karen, the self-appointed queen of Willow Ridge, pearls and paperwork, ruling with a smirk and a clipboard. She wasn't here to live, she was here to control. She saw this road not as lifeline but leverage. She called it private, like she'd written the law herself. She thought she owned the road. She was about to learn the law owned her. The night the ridge burned, oranges carved into my memory like a scar. I was a teenager, lungs raw with smoke, standing barefoot on gravel as the sky glowed the color of molten steel. Embers swirled through the air, stinging my arms, falling across the asphalt like sparks on black paper. The roar of fire sounded less like nature and more like a freight train barreling straight at us. Our neighborhood had only one way out, and for a few heartbeats I wondered if it would hold. Then I heard it, sirens, deep and urgent, climbing the slope. Fire engines thundered through the gap, their lights cutting ribbons through the smoke. Tires screamed on wet pavement, pumps whined, hoses unfurled. That narrow strip of road became a steel artery, carrying the lifeblood of survival. Flames licked fences, ash drifted like snow, and still the trucks kept coming, fueled by seconds we couldn't afford to lose. My father stood beside me, soot streaking his face, eyes locked on the engines. He put a hand on my shoulder, grip hard enough to anchor me. "Keep it clear, son," he said through the smoke. "Flames don't wait for permission." Ever since that night, I've watched that stretch of pavement like a guard dog because I know exactly what happens when it's blocked and the wind shifts. My father's hands were rough as split oak, cracked and scarred from years of gripping hose lines and axes. He wasn't just a firefighter, he was the kind of man who measured life in seconds, because seconds were what separated survival from tragedy. He taught me to read the wind before I ever learned to drive, to know how a shift in its whistle could mean a fire was about to turn. He showed me how to listen to pump cavitation, that hollow rattle that meant water was running low, and to count the heartbeats between radio calls, because silence could mean someone wasn't coming home. To him, the road was never about asphalt or property boundaries. It was a promise carved into the county itself, a guarantee that when the worst came, help could reach us. And when he was gone, I carried that promise like a badge, even when someone else decided it belonged to her. When the house passed into my name, it felt less like a gift and more like a burden that came wrapped in paper and ink. The title sat in my hands, stiff and cold, but the weight of it pressed into my chest far heavier than any document had a right to. To most it was just a deed lines of legalese buried in jargon no one ever bothers to read. But to me it was a vow, sealed not in ink but in blood, smoke and memory. Grief sharpened everything. After my father was gone, every decision felt like it carried his voice, his hand steadying mine from somewhere I couldn't see. I promised myself that while neighbors slept with windows cracked for a breeze, while parents tucked their kids in with bags packed for just in case, I would hold the line. I would guard what he'd fought to preserve. Careful became my armor, and careful made me dangerous to bullies who mistook silence for weakness. What I didn't know then was that the first battle wouldn't be fought with fire or flood, but with ink, and three small words that meant survival or ruin: ingress and egress. Survey pins still sat like rusted teeth at the corners of our property, hammered in decades before I was born. The plat maps, folded and yellowing, showed the road carved straight through the subdivision like a vein that kept the body alive. And then there was the deed clause, written in language older than most fences in Willow Ridge, declaring in crisp black letters that this strip of pavement was more than asphalt. It was a recorded right, not a privilege, not a suggestion, but a legal artery drawn by the county itself. I spent nights studying those documents, tracing the ink with my finger until I could recite every line. The easement wasn't casual, it was permanent, bound to the land the way roots bind to soil. A properly recorded ingress-egress easement runs with the land and cannot be overridden by HOA covenants, conditions, or restrictions. Not by new boards, not by community standards. Only the grantor and the jurisdiction that owns or maintains it can release it. Which is why my jaw clenched the first time someone dared to call it private. The first thing they hand you in Willow Ridge is a glossy brochure that smells faintly of toner, like it rolled off the printer 5 minutes before your tour. The pages beam with stock photos of families tossing frisbees, couples walking golden retrievers along sidewalks so clean they look bleached. Every hedge is trimmed to a perfect triangle, every lawn an identical shade of green. The copy speaks in soft promises, harmony, safety, community standards, monthly dues that looked modest enough you barely noticed them on paper, rules written like polite suggestions, phrased in the language of courtesy instead of control. But brochures are just theater. Behind every smile was a clipboard, behind every word a lever waiting to be pulled. And in neighborhoods like this, soft rules don't stay soft for long. They turn sharp the second the wrong hands pick up the tape measure. Karen arrived the way storms do, without warning but with the certainty of damage. Pearls framed her neck, heels tapped authority against the pavement, and her smile was the kind that didn't warm you, it measured you. She wasn't there to welcome, she was there to catalog, to take mental notes like a tax assessor who found pleasure in the audit. Willow Ridge already whispered her name, real estate queenpin, a woman who could sell beige walls as luxury and then enforce her vision with bylaws wielded like blades. She didn't knock on doors, she announced her presence, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning gutters, hedges, and porches as if she were surveying a conquered city. Then her gaze landed on the road, and for a split second I saw it, ownership flickering in her eyes like a lighter against dry grass. Karen, smug, will keep our road pristine. Me, even. It's a county easement. Karen's patrols became ritual. Every morning her Lexus crept through the cul-de-sac at 5 miles an hour, headlights sweeping across driveways like search beams, clipboard balanced on her arm. A yellow ruler dangling from her fingers, she stopped to measure everything that could possibly be measured. Grass blades trimmed to 3 inches? She claimed 3.5. Trash bin lid propped open by an inch of cardboard? She scribbled a note like it was a felony. Even the angle of a parked truck's tailgate earned an entry in her growing catalog of infractions. It wasn't oversight, it was predation. Each scribble of her pen was less about standards and more about power. And when her husband, safe on the city planning board, turned those scribbles into policy nooses, it gave her intimidation the weight of law. Neighbors learned to duck their heads, to whisper in driveways, to trim grass with anxious precision. To her, it was theater. To us, it was death by 1,000 cuts. And petty cuts turn to blood, when the target isn't lawn clippings but the lifeline that keeps a community breathing. The letters came like clockwork, each one printed on stiff HOA letterhead that smelled faintly of toner and arrogance. At first, it was holiday lights. December had bled into January, and for that I was fined $50 for excessive seasonal display. Next came my work truck, labeled industrial equipment, because apparently a toolbox in the back bed threatened the sanctity of the subdivision. Then it was the reflective markers I'd placed along the edge of the easement, meant to guide delivery drivers and emergency crews on rainy nights. Karen called them visual clutter. Every envelope carried the same sterile phrasing: violation, correction, penalty. Each fine was less about rules and more about rewriting boundaries, a way to redraw the map without daring to touch the lines the county had already drawn. But the parade of paper cuts turned darker when one notice arrived heavier than the rest. This one accused me of encroachment as if the easement my father had protected, the road carved into county records decades before, somehow belonged to her now. Karen, move your posts or face daily penalties. Me, those posts mark an emergency route. The words burned hotter than the July wind, and for the first time I felt real fire lick the back of my neck. At dawn, the school bus would groan up the hill, its diesel cough echoing against the houses, as children shuffled down driveways with backpacks, too heavy for their shoulders. Red taillights blinked like warnings as the driver eased across that strip of pavement, the one artery connecting us to the outside world. Midday brought a different rhythm, ambulances easing to a stop, engines idling while medics hustled stretchers or hauled oxygen tanks across cracked concrete. I'd seen their boots slip on wet asphalt, seen sweat bead under helmets when minutes were measured like heartbeats. To outsiders, it was just another road. To Karen, it was an inconvenience to manicure and measure. But to us, it was the difference between breath and suffocation, between fire held back or flames taking the ridge. That's why every time a siren screamed from the highway, I found myself staring at a watch, counting seconds, wondering if the path would stay open long enough to let them through. I didn't come empty-handed. I came with proof. The deed, the plat, county emails confirming the easement, all spread across the table so the truth could breathe in black and white. I slid the pages toward her like evidence in a trial, every line a reminder that this road wasn't hers to toy with. She barely glanced at them. Instead, she tapped her pen against the clipboard with a smirk that made my jaw lock. Private HOA property, she said, as if 3 words could erase decades of law. That's when I felt the fuse catch flame. Because this wasn't a debate over landscaping, it was life and death masquerading as paperwork. Knowledge nugget din 2. Most counties adopt International Fire Code, SIV IVO 3, which mandates that fire apparatus access roads remain unobstructed and accessible at all times. Fire marshals have the authority to order barriers removed on the spot and issue citations for violations. Her dismissal wasn't just arrogance, it was negligence with the weight of a felony waiting to fall, and she'd already lit the fuse. It started as chatter over fences, neighbors leaning in close, voices lowered like conspirators. Someone swore they'd heard her mention a gate. Another claimed she'd floated the idea of a heavy chain, just to discourage through traffic. The words dripped with her trademark condescension, dressed up as beautification, as if blocking an emergency route could be spun as curb appeal. I listened, and what I heard wasn't beautification, it was blockade. The whispers grew louder each week, carried in mailroom gossip and murmurs at the bus stop. Some rolled their eyes, assuming it was another empty threat, but I knew better. Karen didn't make idle threats. She made plans disguised as suggestions, and she had a habit of carrying them out. The rumor became real the morning I saw a contractor crouched at the easement posts, measuring in the pale light of dawn. That tape measure was a countdown. Nights were restless, the kind where silence pressed heavy against the windows. Across the street I could hear the faint hum of Mr. Jenkins's oxygen machine, steady and fragile, pumping life into lungs too tired to keep rhythm alone. I sat on my porch with a mug of coffee cooling in my hand, eyes fixed on the easement. I spoke quietly into the dark, not just to him but to the memory of my father. I promised no one would choke this road, not while I drew breath. Obstructing a recorded public or emergency easement can trigger county code enforcement, sheriff intervention, and even civil liability. HOA boards that authorize such obstructions risk personal exposure if they act outside their authority, what the law calls ultra vires. The next morning, an orange tag flapped on the stake, installed bollard chain. The clock had started ticking. The first violation notice hit my mailbox like a sucker punch. White envelope, bold HOA letterhead, and a neat line of text demanding $150 for road surface damage caused by school bus traffic. I read it twice, then a third time, thinking maybe fatigue had warped my eyes. Damage? From buses? That stretch of asphalt had been poured thicker than most driveways. designed to carry the weight of fire engines, ambulances, and yes, school buses. My father had watched the county crews lay it down himself, making sure it was built to endure. But Karen framed it differently. She twisted the very lifeline of our neighborhood into a liability, claiming the wear and tear belonged to me, as if I alone had invited the buses to run their routes. Karen, buses wear down our pavement. You'll pay for it. Her smug tone echoed in my head long after I read the line. I saw it for what it was, not a fine but a probe. She wasn't worried about asphalt. She was measuring my reaction, testing how much fight I had in me. Because if she could invent road damage, what would stop her from inventing anything else? That question rattled louder than the buses themselves. The letters didn't stop with that first fine. They multiplied, stacking in my mailbox like warnings carved into paper. Each one carried the same bold header, Willow Ridge Community Standards Enforcement, as if the font alone gave it the authority of law. The ink smelled cheap, but the threats printed on it weren't. Failure to comply will result in lanes, one read. The sentence underlined twice for effect. I knew exactly what that meant. Lanes aren't just penalties, they're shackles. Rack up enough and you can lose the very roof over your head, even if you're paid up on your mortgage. To most families in the neighborhood, those words were financial gunfire, too loud to ignore, too dangerous to resist. I could picture neighbors opening their own envelopes with trembling hands, staring at numbers they couldn't afford, wondering if silence was safer than resistance. That was Karen's game. Intimidation by stationery, turning cheap toner into a weapon. But as the letters kept coming, the language shifted. Polite phrasing gave way to sharper edges, sentences written like verdicts. Each paragraph cut deeper, like she'd traded her pen for a blade. And the worst part was, she was still just warming up. Fear has a way of settling over a neighborhood like fog, creeping in so slowly you don't notice until you can't see 2 feet in front of you. By the time Karen's Lexus crawled past at its ritual pace, headlights sweeping like a searchlight, most people already knew what came next. Porch lights dimmed, conversations cut mid-sentence, and neighbors who once waved across lawns now kept their eyes down, afraid a glance might be mistaken for defiance. I'd hear them whisper, hushed voices carrying over fences like confessions. Got another notice? She measured my grass again. Don't say too much, she'll come after you next. Every word dripped with dread, and every silence confirmed it. It wasn't just the fines, it was the presence, the knowledge that she was always watching, always writing, always ready to twist the smallest misstep into a violation. Fear spread faster than paper, faster than her letters, invisible yet suffocating. And the silence, that was the sharpest blade of all. Because silence meant surrender, and surrender meant Karen had already won in their minds without lifting anything heavier than a clipboard. The cruelest strike didn't land on me. It landed on my sister. She was still recovering from surgery, moving slow, her world measured in careful steps and shallow breaths. I came by one afternoon to check on her and found the violation taped to her front door, flapping in the breeze like a scarlet letter. The words were typed in neat black font, but they may as well have been carved in stone. Improper medical equipment storage, visible wheelchair ramp. I stood there frozen, reading it twice, then a third time, unable to believe what I was seeing. They had fined her for healing, for daring to recover in plain sight. The ramp that let her move safely into her home had been turned into evidence of non-compliance. She sat inside, pale and exhausted, holding the paper in shaking hands. Sister, weakly, they're fining me for breathing. Me, no, they're fining me for fighting back. Her voice cracked, and I saw the light dim behind her eyes. That's when guilt slipped in, heavy as a stone. Karen wasn't just coming after me anymore. She was striking at anyone close enough to wound. That night, I stared at my father's old fire helmet resting on a shelf, its brim still scarred with ash, and I asked myself if this war was worth the cost. The house felt too quiet at night, the kind of quiet that presses against your ribs until you can hear your own heartbeat echoing in your ears. I'd sit in the dark, blinds half open, watching the street lamps throw pale light across the easement. Somewhere in the distance, sirens would wail, a reminder that danger never sleeps, that emergencies don't wait for permission, and I'd wonder if I had the strength left to keep standing. Karen had an entire HOA treasury behind her, dues stacked from every neighbor, a war chest she wielded like a club. Me? I had a pile of violation notices, a sister recovering from surgery, and a promise to a dead man. The weight of it made my will feel smaller by the hour. But then I'd pull out the deed again, run my finger along the words that mattered. Easement law versus HOA, bylaws, easements recorded on deeds override HOA covenants. Courts consistently rule that private associations cannot obstruct or penalize lawful easement use. That clause was my anchor, proof that the law didn't bend for bullies. In the silence, I reminded myself, this road wasn't hers to take, and I wasn't about to hand it over. Karen's next move was escalation. Not content with letters and fines, she decided intimidation needed wheels. That's when Community Safety Patrol showed up. Two men in a white SUV with magnetic decals slapped on the doors, lights that looked official but weren't, and clipboards to complete the illusion. They prowled the road like vultures idling at corners, snapping photos of every delivery truck, tailing school buses as if children were smugglers. Their presence wasn't about safety, it was theater, staged to make neighbors believe she had a private army. I watched them roll slow past my mailbox one afternoon, camera lens poking out the passenger window like a rifle barrel. The neighbors grew more afraid, shrinking deeper into their homes. Packages arrived late because delivery drivers hesitated to cross what they were told was private territory. One FedEx driver stopped me on the shoulder, frustration written all over his sweat-streaked face. "Guard, this isn't a road, it's private property. You're trespassing." The driver shook his head, voice tight with anger. "They told me they'd tow my van if I parked here again. Said I was trespassing on their street." That was the moment the fight changed. Karen wasn't just playing with paper anymore, she had brought in muscle to enforce her lies. And when fake authority starts threatening the people who keep a community running, you know the stakes have turned physical. Paper and fake patrols weren't enough for Karen, her next weapon was words. And words whispered often enough can cut deeper than fines. Soon the neighborhood buzzed with rumors, each one slithering from porch to porch. I was a dangerous ex-cop, they said. Unstable. Looking for a fight, the woman who measured grass blades now measured my character, and she poisoned it with precision. The lies didn't stop at the cul-de-sac. They traveled into town, weaving their way into places that mattered. At the grocery store, eyes lingered on me longer than usual. Conversations went quiet when I stepped into the diner, and worst of all, they crawled into the school board meeting where my sister worked. I'll never forget the look on her face when she told me. They'd asked if she felt safe around me. My sister, the same woman who trusted me to change her bandages after surgery, was suddenly treated as though her brother was a threat to children. Karen wasn't just trying to block a road anymore, she was attempting character assassination piece by piece until people forgot the truth. And that's when I realized she wasn't just stealing asphalt, she was trying to steal reputations. Mine, my sister's, anyone who stood in her way. By the time spring rolled in, the violations were arriving faster than utility bills. Unauthorized traffic, noise disturbance, visual obstruction, none of it real, none of it measurable. But each one printed neatly on HOA letterhead, signed with the weight of false authority, slipped into my mailbox like a dagger wrapped in paper. Karen had perfected the art of fabrication. She knew most people wouldn't fight. Most would sigh, write a check, and move on, thinking it was cheaper to pay than to push back. Every notice stacked like a brick, building a paper tower of lies meant to crush the will of anyone who dared stand. But paper, no matter how high it stacks, can still burn. And lies, no matter how many times they're mailed, still unravel under real law. False HOA violations, civil fraud. When boards knowingly issue false citations, they risk lawsuits for fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Courts have ruled again and again that fabricated violations expose HOAs to damages, and even force them to cover the homeowner's attorney's fees. Her tower looked tall, but towers fall hardest when law calls them what they are, fraud, and I was ready to light the match. It didn't take long before I realized I wasn't the only target. The fines spread like a sickness, striking homes that could least afford the fight. Mr. Harlan, a Marine who still walked with a limp from service overseas, got slapped with a violation because his motorcycle was excessively loud. He showed me the paper, his hands trembling with rage, swearing the bike hadn't even been started in weeks. Then came Denise, a single mother working 2 jobs, cited because her kids left a swing set in the front yard. The HOA called it child play equipment improperly located. To her, it was the only joy her children had between shifts and homework. And Mrs. Callahan, a 78-year-old widow, found herself fined for unprofessional yard decor. Her crime? A line of painted gnomes her late husband had collected over 30 years. She told me in a whisper, tears cutting through wrinkles, they were his pride, now they're a violation. The pattern couldn't have been clearer. The powerless paid first. Veterans, widows, single mothers, they weren't just inconvenienced, they were preyed upon. And every new notice delivered by Karen's hand felt like another knock of a hammer, counting down toward the inevitable question: if she could block children's laughter and silence veterans' pride, when would she decide to block the ambulance? The sky darkened early that week, clouds piling over the ridge like soldiers massing for battle. The air grew thick, charged with the metallic tang that always comes before rain. Asphalt glistened with the first drops, but Karen's patrol didn't slow. Her Lexus crawled the length of the easement, windshield wipers clicking in rhythm with her muttering. I caught fragments as she passed my porch, her voice muffled but sharp. Control of ingress, misuse of property, corrective measures, words that sounded less like neighborhood governance and more like a general preparing for siege. The rain built, streaking down streetlights, pooling in gutters, but still she circled, relentless. Neighbors closed blinds against the storm outside, and the storm that wore pearls and carried a clipboard. I watched her, heart heavy, knowing every lap she made wasn't just observation, it was obsession tightening like a noose. The wind picked up, rattling the loose shingles on my roof, and thunder rolled low in the distance. I thought the storm was just weather, just another test of an old house, against the elements. What I didn't know then was that another storm was already brewing at ground level. The chain had already been cut to length, waiting for its moment. The storm hit with the fury of a war drum, lightning tearing across the sky in jagged white veins. Thunder cracked so loud it rattled the glass in my windows, and rain came down in sheets that turned the asphalt into a slick mirror. It was in that chaos that she made her move. I saw her through the blur of rain, umbrella tucked under one arm, bolt cutters gleaming with each flash of lightning. With practiced precision, she threaded a heavy chain through the iron posts at the mouth of the road and snapped the lock shut. Metal clanged against metal, echoing like a prison door. The lifeline of our neighborhood was sealed, right as the storm screamed its warning. Then came the sound that froze my chest, an ambulance siren wailing in the distance. Red lights pierced the curtain of rain, reflecting off wet pavement, but the chain stood firm, mocking the urgency of life itself. The driver braked hard, horn blaring, trapped by arrogance masquerading as authority. A neighbor's voice cracked through the storm. Neighbor panicked. The ambulance can't get through. Karen turned, rain streaking down her smug smile. Karen, smirking. Rules are rules. Private property. I stepped forward, heart steadying, not from calm but from training. My pulse slowed the way it always had when chaos demanded clarity. I locked eyes with her, voice low, carrying more weight than the thunder. Me low, steady. You just made a felony mistake. Because in that moment, it wasn't HOA harassment anymore. It was obstruction of emergency services. And that was a crime the storm itself seemed eager to punish. The siren's cry split the storm, rising and falling like a wounded animal clawing for air. Red lights flashed across the rain-slick pavement, scattering against puddles and window panes, but the road remained sealed by Karen's chain. The ambulance jolted to a stop, tires hissing, wipers slapping furiously against glass. I could see the silhouettes of medics inside, one pounding the dash in frustration, the other shouting into a radio. Seconds bled into minutes, each one a nail in someone's coffin. Steel links glistened in the storm, mocking the urgency of the moment. Water poured off the chain, pooling into the gutter as though the storm itself wept at the blockade. Neighbors had gathered now, drawn by the siren, faces pale in the strobing red glow. Fear rippled through them. But over it all stood Karen, pearls soaked, clipboard clutched to her chest, a smug grin slicing through the rain. Neighbor yelling, "They can't get through!" Her arrogance was gasoline on the fire already in my veins. My hands clenched, not in panic but in control, the way they used to when a call went sideways on patrol. I wasn't just a homeowner anymore. That was the second my patience snapped. Me, steady. Then we make them. Not as a neighbor, not as a victim, but as someone who once wore the badge. Rain plastered my shirt to my chest, cold seeping into my bones, but I didn't flinch. I stepped out into the open, every stride deliberate, letting her see it in my posture, the deputy still living in me. My badge might have been boxed away years ago, but the stance never left. Shoulders squared, feet firm, eyes steady. It wasn't for show, it was instinct, honed from nights where hesitation meant body bags. Karen's grin faltered when she saw it. For the first time, her smugness cracked, the clipboard shifting slightly in her grip. She'd dealt with neighbors who argued, families who paid out of fear, but she'd never stared down someone who knew the system better than she could manipulate it. Because leaving the uniform behind never meant leaving the law. I carried the codes, the procedures, the weight of authority burned into muscle memory, and I still had friends who wore the star, men and women who didn't take kindly to hearing an ambulance had been trapped behind a suburban power trip. The storm raged around us, but my mind was calm. My hand was already moving toward my phone, because I knew exactly which number to dial. The rain pelted down so hard it stung, but my grip on the phone didn't falter. I pressed it tight to my ear, listening to the static of the storm crackle through the line until the dispatcher's voice cut in. Calm, professional. I gave her the words that would change everything. Emergency access obstruction. The phrase dropped heavier than thunder. It wasn't neighborhood gossip. It wasn't a civil disagreement over bylaws. It was a code every first responder understood, and once spoken, it couldn't be taken back. My voice was steady, even as water streamed down my face. The storm didn't muffle my clarity. It sharpened it, turned every syllable into steel. I laid it out plain. Ambulance blocked, chain across a county easement, residents endangered. On the other end, the tone shifted, precise and urgent. Units were already moving. Emergency access law is clear. Blocking an ingress-egress easement used by emergency vehicles is often prosecuted as a Class B misdemeanor. But if injury or death results, those charges escalate fast. Felony obstruction of justice, the kind that can carry real prison terms. Karen thought she was fighting me. She thought this was still an HOA spat. But the moment that report went out, it became something else entirely, a criminal investigation. The storm lit up in flashes of white, but the real light came from the distance, a strobing red and blue that carved through the sheets of rain like a blade. Tires hissed against slick asphalt as the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, headlights glaring at the barricade. The chain trembled under the wash of color, rattling with each gust of wind as though it already sensed its fate. Neighbors spilled from porches, drawn by the spectacle, phones lifted high to catch every second. The ambulance still idled behind the blockade, its sirens silenced now, lights pulsing like a heartbeat. Medics stood outside, arms folded across rain-soaked uniforms, frustration sharp in their voices as they waited for the law to clear the way. The cruiser door opened with deliberate weight and out stepped Sheriff Torres, rain rolling off his wide-brimmed hat, expression cut from stone. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. His authority was the storm now, and every eye turned to him. But Karen didn't flinch. She planted her heels into the puddled ground, arms crossed, clipboard clutched like a shield. She had out-argued neighbors, intimidated families, and bent board meetings to her will. And in her arrogance, she believed she could out-argue the law itself. Sheriff Torres stood like a wall against the storm, his broad shoulders squared beneath a raincoat that glistened with every flash of lightning. He didn't need to announce himself. Authority rolled off him the way water rolled from the brim of his hat. But before he could even speak, Karen pounced. Her pearls clung to her neck, soaked and gleaming under the cruiser's lights, but her voice carried the same brittle confidence it always had. She jabbed her clipboard forward like a scepter, every word sharpened to sound like law. Karen, this is private HOA property. You have no jurisdiction here. The words came out triumphant, her chin lifted as if she'd already won. Neighbors shifted uneasily in the shadows, some whispering, others recording with trembling hands. Karen's smirk grew wider when silence followed, mistaking the pause for victory. But then Torres lifted his head, eyes narrowing beneath the brim, and when he spoke, his voice hit like a hammer against steel. Sheriff Torres. Actually, ma'am, this is a county easement. The smirk faltered, but only for a heartbeat. She tried to gather herself, opening her mouth for another protest, but Torres didn't give her the air. Sheriff Torres, and you just committed obstruction of justice. The words cracked louder than thunder, and in that instant the storm didn't matter. Every neighbor watching knew the balance of power had just shifted, and Karen wasn't holding the reins anymore. Rain still hammered the pavement when another figure stepped forward from the cruiser's shadow. County Inspector Hale, binder clutched against his chest, the kind of man who carried history and paperwork instead of weapons. He flipped the cover open, shielding the pages from the storm with his arm, and laid the truth bare for everyone to see. Inside were the originals, plat maps, survey notes, and the easement clause itself, inked decades before Karen ever closed her first real estate deal. The paper had yellowed with time, corners curled, but the black lettering remained bold and absolute. Ingress and egress shall remain unobstructed for county access in perpetuity. Hale's voice carried over the storm as he read, firm and undeniable. The neighbors leaned in, phones raised, recording every syllable. The authority wasn't just in his tone, it was in the ink, in the signatures of officials long gone, whose foresight was now Karen's undoing. She stood rigid, rain-streaking mascara across her cheekbones, lips pressed tight as if she could hold back reality with silence. But her eyes betrayed her. The flicker of panic, quick and sharp, was caught by every camera. And just like that, Karen's carefully manufactured control cracked on record, in public, forever. Sheriff Torres didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. Authority vibrated in every syllable, iron forged into sound. He took one deliberate step toward the blockade, rain bouncing off his coat, and pointed at the chain glistening under the cruiser lights. "Remove it, now." 2 deputies moved immediately, their hands steady as they worked the lock, and unhooked the steel. The chain clattered against the posts, heavy links crashing to the ground like a sentence being carried out. Neighbors erupted in cheers, their relief cutting through the storm louder than thunder. For the first time in months, the road was free. Karen's voice shrieked above the celebration, high and brittle, demanding recognition, sputtering about rights and property lines. But her protests were swallowed by applause, drowned out by the sound of the chain being dragged away. Torres didn't waste time with arguments. He stepped close enough that only she could hear him, his words low and precise, the kind of warning that leaves no room for misinterpretation. "Sheriff Torres, replace this chain again, and I'll replace your pearls with handcuffs." The storm raged on, but in that moment, the real thunder had already struck. The moment the chain hit the asphalt, something shifted in the air, heavier than the storm itself. Doors opened, porch lights flicked on, and neighbors who had been hiding in shadows for months stepped into the rain. One by one, they poured out from their porches, phones lifted high, recording everything, the deputies dragging the chain, the ambulance finally inching forward, Karen's face tightening like wet plaster under the red and blue glow. For the first time in too long, fear wasn't in their voices. It was laughter. It was relief. Some clapped, others shouted. A few let years of pent-up frustration spill out as righteous anger. They weren't whispering anymore. They were roaring, the storm amplifying every cheer. I saw Mrs. Callahan, the widow fined for her husband's gnomes, holding up her phone with hands that didn't tremble. I saw Denise, the single mother, laughing through tears as she filmed Karen sputtering. And Miss Herlin, the Marine, stood tall despite his limp, recording the woman who had tried to break him with fake fines. The power Karen had fed on silence, intimidation, fear evaporated in seconds. Authority no longer sat in her clipboard. It lived in the crowd, in the cameras, in the undeniable truth playing out live. And those videos weren't staying in Willow Ridge. They were about to go viral. By the time dawn broke, the storm had passed, but its echo was still alive on every neighbor's phone. Within hours, the clips were stitched together, uploaded and shared with captions that cut sharper than any fine. HOA Karen blocks ambulance. Sheriff shuts her down. Community rises against tyrant. The views climbed like wildfire on dry brush. Hundreds turned to thousands, then hundreds of thousands, each share adding more fuel. The sight of flashing red lights trapped behind a chain, while a smug woman argued private property, struck nerves far beyond Willow Ridge. Veterans reposted it with fury. Paramedics and firefighters flooded the comments condemning her arrogance. Ordinary homeowners saw their own Karens in her face and added their outrage to the storm. Karen thought she had controlled the narrative. That silence meant power, but online silence broke into ridicule. Memes plastered her expression across timelines. News outlets called it obstruction. To her, it was a community spat. To the world, it was attempted manslaughter by HOA. And while she flailed against the tidal wave of public humiliation, the board she once ruled sat quietly, watching. They saw what everyone else did. The crown had slipped, and they smelled blood in the water. The next HOA session was standing room only. Folding chairs scraped against the tile floor as neighbors packed the room, phones still buzzing with the viral storm that had painted Karen across every screen in America. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, harsh and unflattering, and for once her pearls didn't shine, they clung to her neck like chains. She opened the meeting with the same brittle confidence she always carried, clipboard in hand, voice pitched to carry authority. "Karen, you're all misinformed. I acted for the community. What you saw was selective editing. Fake news meant to smear your board and its mission of safety." But this time, her words didn't land. Board members shifted uneasily in their seats, eyes down, fingers twitching against the edges of their folders. The audience murmured, restless. Every excuse she offered only fanned the heat in the room. "Board member, you acted against the law." Karen's jaw snapped shut, but before she could recover, a voice rose from the back. "Neighbor," shouting, "and against us." The room erupted, months of pent-up silence cracking like glass under pressure. One of the board members, face pale under the fluorescent glare, finally broke. He pulled a letter from a manila envelope, hands shaking as he unfolded it. And when he read aloud the county's official declaration that Karen's actions were illegal, documented in black and white, the last of her control shattered. The queen had been stripped bare, and the court of neighbors was no longer hers to command. Karen's voice climbed higher with every word, sharp and shrill as if sheer volume could patch the cracks spreading beneath her feet. She rattled off half-formed defenses, claims of misinterpretation, accusations of sabotage, mutterings about conspiracies, but the room wasn't listening anymore. The neighbors who once lowered their voices when her Lexus rolled by now raised them in jeers. Laughter cut through her protests, loud and unrestrained, the kind born from months of swallowed fear finally released. Every excuse she gave was met with boos, every gesture with shaking heads. The board fractured in real time. Members leaned away from her, arms crossed, lips pressed into hard lines of self-preservation. They could see what I saw that night in the rain. Her power was an illusion built on silence, and silence was gone. She gripped her clipboard like a life raft, but even that symbol looked flimsy under the weight of the truth projected on every phone screen in the room. Her pearls glistened under the fluorescent lights, but now they looked less like trophies and more like shackles. Her reign hadn't just faltered, it had ended, and nothing she did, no chain or lock or threat, could bind the truth again. The storm may have broken her image, but it was the county attorney who broke her shield. Within a week, an official probe was launched, and investigators descended on Willow Ridge with clipboards, subpoenas, and a hunger for truth. They weren't neighbors she could bully or delivery drivers she could scare off. They were professionals trained to sift lies from ledgers. They combed through financial records like wildfire through dry brush, leaving nothing unturned. Each folder, each line item revealed more rot beneath her glossy brochures, refunds never processed, safety assessments that vanished into private accounts, fines invented without a shred of legitimacy. What had seemed like petty harassment on paper quickly bloomed into patterns of fraud. Witness statements piled up just as quickly. Neighbors came forward with violation notices, each one a nail hammered into the coffin of her credibility. Even her own allies on the board began to distance themselves, their silence broken under the weight of subpoenas. Karen had built her empire with paper and signatures, but now that same paper had become the weapon cutting her down. The verdict hadn't been read yet, but everyone in the room knew the truth. Her crown had already cracked. The first sign of change wasn't a headline or a courtroom declaration, it was an envelope. Neighbors who had written checks in fear, who had scraped together money they couldn't afford just to avoid losing their homes, started receiving refund notices. One by one, families opened letters that didn't demand payment but promised restitution. I watched Mrs. Callahan clutch hers with trembling hands, whispering through tears that she'd thought she would never see that money again. Denise, the single mother, held her check high so her kids could see it, proof that the swing set in her yard had never been a crime. Even Miss Harlan, the Marine, shook his head in disbelief, muttering that justice had finally walked back into Willow Ridge. At the courthouse, liens that once hung over families like storm clouds were erased from the record. It was as if Karen's shadow had been scrubbed from the paper itself. Everything she built, every threat, every dollar squeezed from fear was unraveling in reverse. And with each refund delivered, every lien dissolved. Another nail was driven into her legacy's coffin, sealing it tighter than any lock she'd ever tried to place on that road. When the county turned its eye on Karen, she made one last desperate move. She tried to sell her house. For years she'd branded herself the queen of real estate, boasting she could flip anything with a coat of paint and a clever listing. But this time her crown worked against her. Her name was poison ink on any contract. Potential buyers toured the property, their smiles polite, their questions stiff. But the moment they connected her address to the viral scandal, their offers withered. Who wanted to inherit a house that had become a national symbol of arrogance? Who wanted to sleep under the roof of the woman who blocked an ambulance? Worse, property values across Willow Ridge began to sink. Her empire had relied on image, neat lawns, safety, exclusivity. Now the very market she claimed to control mocked her. Every failed showing, every canceled offer stripped her throne bare. She thought she controlled the market, but the market laughed back, and it left her sitting alone inside a castle she could no longer sell. The evening air carried that low, steady hum I'd grown up with, the sound of a fire truck easing down the ridge. Its lights weren't frantic this time, no desperate rush, just a steady pulse of red against the fading orange sky. Tires rolled over asphalt slick from the last rain, every rotation a reminder that the road was clear. No chain, no gate, no blockade pretending to be authority. Neighbors stood on porches, watching the truck pass, some raising hands in quiet salutes, others just breathing easier. I caught the reflection of the rig in puddles and thought of my father, of his boots hitting the same pavement decades before. The siren wailed once, not in alarm but in ritual, before fading into the hills like a hymn, a song of protection sung to the whole neighborhood. And in that moment I realized the road wasn't just open, it was finally free. The first block party in years came together like it had been waiting beneath the surface, ready to erupt once fear was gone. Grills flared to life, sending ribbons of barbecue smoke curling into the evening air. Tables lined the street, covered in potluck casseroles, paper plates, and pies that tasted sweeter because they were shared without worry. Kids rode bikes in circles across the pavement, their laughter echoing off houses that had once kept blinds drawn tight. Music spilled from someone's speaker, a mix of country twang and old rock anthems, and the sound felt like reclamation, like the neighborhood had finally remembered itself. Veterans swapped stories without looking over their shoulders. Single mothers laughed without fear of notices arriving Monday morning, and widows sat comfortably in lawn chairs, smiling at the sight of gnomes returned proudly to their gardens. No one spoke Karen's name. They didn't need to. Her shadow had been burned away, replaced by law and community standing taller than her clipboard ever did. It smelled like charcoal and freedom. It smelled like victory. The morning sun lit the pavement when the ambulance pulled smoothly onto the easement. No hesitation, no blockade, no delay. Its siren was off this time, only the soft rumble of its engine as it rolled to a stop in front of Mr. Jenkins's house. Medics stepped out casually, carrying their bags, not rushing against stolen seconds but walking at a human pace. From his porch, Mr. Jenkins raised a frail hand. Oxygen tube looped around his ears, the plastic catching sunlight like a thread of glass. He smiled, thin but real, and gave a small wave to the medics, to me, to the open road itself. It wasn't dramatic. No storm, no confrontation, just access, exactly what the law, the deed, and my father's promise had always guaranteed. That wave carried more weight than any courtroom ruling ever could. The emergency HOA meeting didn't feel like politics, it felt like a reckoning. Neighbors filled the community hall, not with fear this time, but with purpose. For once, the room wasn't quiet when a chair scraped or a voice rose, it was alive, buzzing with people who'd finally remembered they had power. When nominations were called, voices spoke my name, steady and certain. It wasn't about ambition or titles, it was about trust, the kind forged in storms and sirens, not in campaign flyers. The vote was swift. The decision unanimous. They handed me a seat at the board table, not to play politician, but to make sure no one like Karen ever ruled by intimidation again. My first act was simple: freeze the dues, tear down the predatory policies, rewrite the bylaws in plain language everyone could understand. Fear had owned this road once. It never would again. The sheriff's badge had left my chest, but the people had just given me another one. Karen believed ownership was about control, about chains and locks and paper threats stacked high enough to scare people silent. She thought she owned the road because she could measure it, fine it, and guard it with her false authority. But she forgot the oldest truth my father drilled into me. On long nights when the ridge glowed with fire, the law doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the heaviest hand. The law belongs to the people it protects. And when people remember that, when they rise together instead of hiding behind closed blinds, no bully, no board, no Karen can hold power for long. The road is open now. Not because of me alone, but because neighbors stood, sheriffs acted, and the truth proved heavier than fear. Justice wasn't just served here. It was shared, piece by piece, until the whole community could breathe free again. This story isn't just mine, it belongs to every neighbor who's ever been cornered by a clipboard, every family who's felt the weight of fear in their own driveway. If you've lived through your own HOA nightmare, I want to hear it. Drop your story in the comments below, because when we share them, we remind bullies they don't win in silence. And if you want more justice served, more Karens unmasked, more chains broken, make sure to subscribe. This fight is bigger than one road, bigger than one neighborhood, because every story told is another chain broken.